Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the process of creating a simple character, a cultist girl, in 3ds Max 2024, Rizom UV, and Substance Painter. My character isn't particularly well optimized. Her total polygon count is around 20k polygons, and twice as many triangles. Let's start with a short introduction. In 3ds Max, I use a free script called Loop Regularizer, which transforms selected groups of points into perfect circles. You can use the Repeat Tools script for the same purpose. I also rely on the Weighted Normals modifier. Back in the day, it had to be downloaded separately, and I'm not sure if it's now included in the standard Max package. Rizom isn't mandatory. I use it for speed, and I really like its straightening algorithm. Generally, you can unwrap a model in any program you prefer, but doing it in 3ds Max without specialized plugins is a bad and very inconvenient idea. In Substance Painter, I didn't use complex materials or any third-party content, just a couple of basic smart materials and simple materials I created myself. The entire modeling and texturing process took me about 5 to 6 hours, including a few blockouts since I didn't use references. I sped up the video to keep it from being too dull, and added subtitles in case you want to slow it down by 4 times and mute the sound. I won't be narrating the entire video and will occasionally go silent, only voicing the intro to each new section. The table of contents is available in both the video description and the pinned comment. If you enjoy my content, give this video a like or even subscribe to my channel. I'd be thrilled to have you along. I assembled the entire model as a single object. There are no intersecting objects or overlapping UV maps. However, the model contains a certain number of triangles and pole points, where more than 5 edges converge. We don't want triangles or pole points in areas where the geometry will bend during animation, but it's unlikely anyone will peek inside the character's collar or under her dress. A poly count of 20k polygons or 40k triangles for a single character is considered mid to high for an indie game, depending on the context. Modern PCs and consoles can handle characters with 20 to 50k triangles relatively well, especially for a main character or hero asset that appears prominently. If your indie game features only a few characters on screen, being a single-player adventure with one main character, a 40k triangle model is more feasible. However, if your game includes multiple characters, in case with a multiplayer game or one with many NPCs, the cumulative potential could overwhelm the engine. 10 characters at 40k triangles each would result in almost 500,000 triangles just for characters, excluding environment geometry, UI, and effects. Camera distance matters a lot. If the character is often viewed up close, a higher poly count is justified to ensure visual fidelity. For distant characters, lower poly counts, up to 15k triangles, are sufficient, as details are less noticeable. If your game is a visually ambitious indie title, a 40k triangle character might be justified for a hero character, provided you optimize elsewhere. For smaller scale indie games, this poly count could be overkill, especially if it impacts frame rate or development time. In some modern games, characters have up to 100k polygons or even more, but these games have large budgets and extensive optimization including loads and culling. Supporting characters or NPCs might use 20 to 40k triangles. In summary, it can be said that I created the model without a concept or references, largely relying on intuition and moving the NURMS mesh lattice points back and forth. I didn't perform retopology, which could have significantly reduced the polygon count, nor did I use the classic workflow of baking a high poly model onto a low poly one. Additionally, my model contains a certain number of triangles, which prevents me from easily creating multiple versions of it, which would simplify the creation of flawed versions. As a result, I simply left the model as it was. Proper retopology could have reduced the polygon count by at least half, ideally bringing the number of triangles down to approximately 15k. Of course, sculpting and baking a high poly version of the model would have been very useful. Since we are already using a normal map, it makes sense to maximize its potential. For the purposes of this video demonstration, I unwrapped my model onto a single 4K texture map with a padding of 32. It can easily be scaled down to 2K reso with a padding of 16, without noticeable quality losses. I wanted to create a simple character and a cloak, but I wouldn't recommend starting with it. Fabrics often require a special approach for animation and significantly limit the use of simple rigging tools, such as the high-quality and free AccuRig software. Also, think twice before deciding to create a character with long fingers or tentacles. In this case, you'll lose access to classic humanoid animations and encounter numerous issues where the model's fingers intersect with its dress, other fingers, or other elements of the model. Overall, you can always manually adjust the weights and add a few bones to the cloak, but this will significantly complicate and slow down your workflow. On the other hand, if you create a character in tight-fitting clothing, you will gain access to an easy rigging process that requires minimal additional tweaks. In the case of this model, I began the creation process with the most challenging part, the cloak and hood, because I was confident that if I get those right, adding a simple girlish face combining features of a grey alien and a Protoss would be relatively straightforward. I didn't adhere to any specific proportions. Naturally, if you are creating a character for a particular game, you should align their measurements with the dimensions of surrounding objects. While modeling the cloak, I aimed to emphasize the curves of a feminine body without being overly revealing, shaping a Christmas tree silhouette that narrows upwards, with a focus on a slim waist. I used the NURMS process, pushing the iteration count to 3. Perhaps I should have stuck to 2 or performed manual retopology. It's best to spend as much time as possible in NURMS mod. Once we convert the model to an editable poly, we lose the ability to perform non-destructive editing. I made the cloak's sleeves wide enough to provide maximum freedom for our character's slender arms, ensuring that her joints wouldn't intersect with the fabric in most cases, except during complex animation like classical dance moves or other elegant actions. In the end, each full circle describing the character's waist ended up with 52 sides. Many indie games use 8 to 16 sides, while 16 to 32 sides provide nearly perfect smoothness, especially when combined with baking. The sleeves have 16 sides each. I sped up the part of the video where I moved lattice points, because it took me a significant amount of time to find the shape that felt optimal. The central fold, mimicking a cloak's slit, and some clothing behind it, through which the belt later passes, was created using the inset tool. Its sides received 5 bevels, 2 inset iterations. Overkill, especially since any number of bevels could simply be baked onto the low poly version. Generally, 1 or 3 bevels are sufficient for most models. The best approach often involves drawing bevels without modeling them. Really, why bother with normal maps or baking complex geometry, when we can just draw the bevels and other details? That said, this requires knowing how to hand paint. The side curves of the cloak's slit ended up with an absurd amount of unnecessary geometry. There's serious potential for model optimization here. Volume for the sleeves and lower part of the model was added using the shell modifier. I also removed a significant number of internal edge loops. You shouldn't do it if your cloak is thin and you plan to animate it with multiple bones. In that case, you risk a scenario where the outer fabric elements might occasionally intersect with a simpler inner geometry, like during sharp character movements. This issue disappears if you use one-sided tight-fitting clothing or a cloak with a narrow base. A common solution is simply using a one-sided cloak for characters without legs. I tried to address this by keeping the cloak's edges as far as possible from the girl's thin legs. The hood was created using the same method as the cloak, by turning a standard box into a NURMS object with 2 iterations. Like the cloak, it also ended up with excessive polygon count, practically begging for manual retopology. As an alternative, I could have tried achieving the same shape, with just 1 NURMS iteration. When shaping the hood, I didn't consider that I absolutely didn't want its inner side to mirror the geometry of the outer side, especially the part with the tip, or whatever that thing is called. Generally, we want to simplify the geometry hidden behind the character's head as much as possible, but not to the point where it intersects the other geometry on head turns. I reduced the hood's polygon count, aligning its polygons with the corresponding part of the cloak, so they could later be merged into a single piece using the bridge tool. Initially, I gave the hood's outer edges 5 bevels, 2 bevel iterations, but later reduced this to 3. I made both the cloak and the girl's hood thick enough. After all, this is a stylized character, so a lack of detail is compensated by exaggerated proportions. The collar and sleeves were shaped into perfect circles using loop regularizer. The girl's collar ended up with 52 sides, just like her entire cloak. This number isn't just excessive. Ideally, we would want to cut it at least in half. You need to be extremely careful with bevels. Every 2 additional lines add hundreds of polygons and 200 triangles to the count. Flexible elements, like the collar connecting the cloak and hood, need enough polygons to bend or rotate during animation. That said, 52 sides, as in my case, plus 3 supporting edge loops, is way too much for a character like this. The girl's head was formed as an arm subject with 2 iterations, as usual derived from a simple box. Our character combines traits of the Predator, Gorgon, Grey Alien, and a Protoss girl. I experimented with the shape for a long time, before cutting out holes for thick hair using Provolone operations followed by manual retopology. The head's circumference ended up with nearly 40 sides, again, almost twice as many as needed. The eyes also got a whopping 28 sides. On one hand, this gives optimal smoothness, but on the other, 15 sides wouldn't have been much different visually. As for the dreads, I gave them 16 sides based on the side count I got from the automated retopology. In this case, I clearly lacked proper planning. In retrospect, I'd limit each hair to 8 sides. The curvature of the hair is crucial, so you should increase the number of supporting polygon rings in the foreground, in front of the girl's face, and reduce them where the hood conceals them. Generally, cutting holes in her head isn't necessary. The dreads could simply emerge from beyond the viewer's line of sight as separate objects. As with the character's body, I spent as much time as possible in NURMS mode to avoid altering the base geometry shape later. Like with the cloak, I worked on one side of the model, then mirrored it. The hood is convenient because it blocks side and rear views of the head, letting us focus on the front angle. However, it introduces potential animation limitations. For instance, the character can't look over her shoulder or up without significant polygon deformation around the collar. I modeled the head for quite a while because I wanted to fill the hood while leaving space for the dreads. In the end, the head turned out relatively small, with the hood seemingly resting on a couple of girls' upper hairs. You shouldn't create too many hairs. It's better to give them graceful trajectories and make them thick enough. For my design, it's best to have 3 to 4 dreads on each side of the character's head. Significant optimization potential lies in avoiding holes for the hair or reducing their side count to 8. Additionally, you could greatly simplify the back of the head or even rework the head into a mask without a back. The dreads can intersect the inner side of the hood, but shouldn't extend beyond its outer side, including during head turns in animation. The side count of the chin's lower circumference should match the side count of the opening between the shoulders to connect them with the neck. My neck ended up with 34 sides, too many. It would be better to reduce this to 10 to 12 sides considering its thickness. I'll resume the narration in the next chapter of the video. The eyes were created from a hemisphere, compressed and stretched along several axes using the FFD 4x4 modifier. Their side count matched the 28 sides of the skull's eye sockets. Ideally, this number should have been halved. At the very least, 16 to 18 sides would have provided smooth shapes, plus we could have relied on baking or hand painting. The edges of the eye sockets received 5 bevels. This could have been reduced to 3, or we could have relied on hand painting. At some point, I blocked a couple of extra holes in the character's head to reduce the number of hair strands. When creating the hair, I marked the centers of all holes on the character's head and drew splines to them, which I later applied the loft modifier to. Each dreadlock ended up with 16 sides, dreadfully too many, as 8 would have been enough. However, you shouldn't skimp on supporting edge loops, we want smooth, flowing hair, not angular spider legs. You shouldn't use more than 8 hair strands, and those you do use should be thick enough. I set the spline vertices to smooth mode. As I mentioned earlier, the hair doesn't have to be part of the head. It can easily extend from behind the head as separate 8-sided objects. This approach would cut our polygon count in half. Creating 8 individual hair strands took quite a while, as the process was repeated 7 times. I cut this part from the video to save your time. I widened the ends of each dreadlock and gave them 2 bevels. I matched the number of sides on the cloak's collar to the number of sides on the girl's chin, and connected these elements with a curved neck. The neck received several supporting edge loops to ensure its curvature and to echo the waist's shape. I broke the central symmetry of the hood using the FFD 4x4 modifier. The boots were created using the same NURBS method as the rest of the model. The soles ended up with 52 sides, way too many. Manual retopology could have cut this number at least in half, especially since we are not going to watch her boots up close. The toe area has 30 sides, ideally it should have been 10 to 12 sides, and the shins have 20 sides, twice as many as the legs. Again, ideally this should have been halved. Nothing was stopping us from baking more detailed boots onto their low poly version. I abandoned the idea of adding lacing as a group of intersecting splines because I didn't want to overload the model with details. In this case, it's better to stick to a classical stylized modeling approach and focus on thick, cartoony elements. The boots themselves need to be thick enough to contrast with the girl's delicate and slender legs. I tried to reduce the topology manually, but proper manual retopology would definitely have been the better solution. In that case, we would create a low poly model from scratch and not worry about reducing the polygon count of our high poly model. On the contrary, we could have applied a couple of turbosmooth iterations to it. Once I was satisfied with the boot's shape, I duplicated it, mirrored the copy, added a couple of edges, curved them using edge constraint mode, and shaped them into fabric wrappings that match similar elements on the girl's arms. The wrappings got 3 bevels, though one would have sufficed, especially when baking. I cut out the part of the video where I added wrappings to the second boot. The process is identical to the first. I edited and rounded the upper parts of the boots, and connected them to the bottom of the cloak with thin legs, each having 10 sides. No retopology is needed here. I shaped the bottom of the cloak, adding a bunch of triangles. If we assume someone might peek under the girl's cloak, it's better to avoid triangles, as they can bend oddly during animation. In particular, this modeling approach shouldn't be used if our heroine decides to dance ballet in this cloak, otherwise it may be fine. I added knees to her legs and a couple of lines at the intended bending points, ensuring proper polygon division in these areas to prevent the base tube from collapsing on movement, which often turns joints into flat planes. Many indie projects simply ignore these situations, but this step can slightly improve the model's quality. The arms were created using the same method as in my previous projects. I started with a box primitive, divided it into 3 parts, switched to NURBS mode, and gave it one iteration, so that the finger holes each had 8 sides. Then I created separate branches for the thumbs. In total, I formed 4 tentacle-like fingers using lofts and splines. The tentacles look cool and give our girl a creepy vibe, but they create a few significant issues. First, we'll lose the ability to use some great free rigging tools. If we add say 4 joints to the bending points of the tentacles, they'll constantly collide with each other, requiring manual animation adjustments. Additionally, if we use free animation tools like those I've mentioned before, the tentacles will often intersect with the cloak and other model elements. However, if we animate them ourselves or tinker with them a little bit, everything will be fine, especially after editing the weight paint. The girl's arms aren't symmetrical, and their tentacles differ slightly. For us, this is another opportunity to break symmetry. I attached the loft to the arms and removed some supporting edge loops. Here, you need to ensure there are enough edge loops for the fingers to bend properly. You shouldn't place the arms too close to the dress, especially if you plan to use simplified rigging programs. Otherwise, the finger joints might pull the cloak's fabric along with them. In general, it's best to create the model in a classical T-pose, but in our case it's not hard to reposition it into a T-pose during rigging in AccuRig. I added the same wrappings to the palms as I did to the boots. Similar wrappings were also added to the girl's arms. I included joints with a bending line, similar to those placed on the model's legs. This part is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I save my model, reset my girl's pivot point, scale, rotation and X-form, set her pivot point to the bottom of her middle part and place her to 000 scene coordinates. You'll likely place her center between the middles of the soles of her boots so that she can rotate around her central axis. Then I use the selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angons. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next I use the 3ds Max's Axio tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. If you added some extra elements to the girl's exterior, make sure they intersect her and each other properly and don't share any vertices or planes. At this point, you shall also reset the scale, rotation and X-form of most elements and set their pivot points manually, remembering their proper initial rotation angles. If you used mirroring or symmetry while modeling, it's especially important to reset the X-form of your model and make sure that there are no flipped normals remaining. Just make sure to save your file before resetting the X-form. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done, you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. Hard edge placement is about controlling low poly smoothing behavior and baked normal gradations. UV seam placement is about optimizing usable texture space while also limiting texture distortion. Bringing the two together is about balancing visual quality with resource efficiency. Using fewer hard edges and UV splits tends to be more resource efficient, but it's also important to make sure the final product looks good. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks and shapes. Normally, you can avoid sharp angles and hard edges by beveling and chamfering these edges and going with everything smooth. It means more polygons, but less drastic gradients on the low poly shading for the normal map to compensate when baked. To further improve shading on beveled low poly models, you can use weighted normals. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 4K Reso UV map with a pixel padding of 32. That's pretty generous for this kind of a character, especially considering the fact we use normals but don't bake anything. We can easily scale it down to 2K Reso. It may work for some indie project, but the real production grade thing would require some sculpted and hand-painted details and much more optimization. After all, we want to pull the maximum of existing UV maps. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next, I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom. Make sure to straighten hair, hands, legs and other cylindrical objects for obvious reasons. At some point, we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix, no matter what tricks you try. I unwrap the model to ensure no overlapping UV elements. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of rays on all tabs, disable the ID section, and switch my subsampling to 16. I've also made sure that there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. My texturing process went pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand painted it, but I mostly relied on some simple grunges. My fabric material consists of 5 layers. The first one defines the base color and roughness. Each additional layer alters the height and color of specific fabric areas. They are hidden by black masks and receive fill layers containing various grunges. The first creates a fabric fold effect, using Crystal 2 grunge. A couple of subsequent layers add different close folds medium, varying from each other including their tiling. The final bright layer is hidden under a black mask and uses a mask generator. I adjust its curvature to slightly highlight the cloak's edges and other faces. I also tweak its blending options to make it less intense. All other fabrics are modified versions of the first material. In some cases, I change the angle of the folds, making them vertical for the inner clothing and horizontal for the fabric belt. I use the base material for the wrappings on the arms and legs, the cloak and the hood. At some point, you may want to switch the projection method of your grunges to triplanar. This will hide most visible UV seams. I have created multiple versions of my main material and used them to color various parts of my model, and only then brought them together, making them dimmer and darker with time. The skin of our girl is based on a slightly modified creature skin smart material, while the soles of her boots use rubber dry. The hair also relies on creature skin, but gets an additional fill layer that has a black mask and a grunge 005 applied to it. The same goes for the girl's eyes, but I add a glow to them by activating the emission channel in the shader set settings menu. Finally, I apply some ground dirt to the cloak and tweak its settings, global balance and curvature. Remember to block out your colors first and only bring them together when you see a reference image, a pre-made color palette, or your model in general. This is much easier than trying to match colors one by one. I've removed some parts of the video where I pick colors. It took me long enough. It is also much easier to use dark and dim colors if you are a beginner than to properly pick bright ones. I didn't see many UV seams, so there was no need to cover them with a paint layer and a clone stamp tool this time. Make sure to rotate your environment and alter your lighting settings now and then to see how your model performs in different environments. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.